Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie, welcoming today Happymon Jacob from Jawaharlal Nehru University to speak to us about the upcoming G20. And so excited for so many reasons. First of all, because this is the launch of our fourth season, and we welcome all of your audience comments. Please get in touch with us. We want to make the doorstep for you. We are starting off with a big discussion about the global world order, what's going on, what can we expect, who are the powers that are going to rise over the next couple of years. And we're so happy to have Happymon explain that to us. Thank you so much for joining us today, Happymon, on the eve of the G20 summit in Delhi. We have been hearing headlines here in the U.S. about Biden arriving in Delhi, but the most ambitious headline I saw was Modi has a successful G20 summit from The Economist. Really? It didn't even happen. So I'd like to get behind some of these headlines that we're reading here, some of what the headlines coming from Delhi, and kind of what you're seeing. I know that you're in Kiev today, so and that's going to be a topic of the summit, so we can get to that. But for our audience here in the U.S., what we try to do is get behind the headlines. And if you can walk us through what you're seeing in the headlines and what's reality, what are true expectations for this summit? There are a couple major players not there. But what is really happening here? Are we experiencing a global power shift?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. Let me sort of drive right into it. My feeling is that some of the headlines may be a little exaggerated, but not that exaggerated. Let me put it this way. This is not the first time the G20 summit is taking place anywhere in the world. The summits have been taking place for the last 2 decades or so. But what I think makes this year's summit important is because it is taking place at a time when there is a great deal of uncertainty in the international system. There are so many geopolitical considerations and calculations riding on this summit, and New Delhi has made it a point to showcase the summit as its opportunity to sort of assert itself in the international system. And therefore, you're looking at a very unique sort of context in which this summit is taking place. On the one hand, you have the Ukraine-Russia war that is taking place, and I'm speaking from Kiev, where I arrived yesterday. And this is going to be one of the major hot topics discussed at the summit. Although the summit is not a security conference, it is supposed to be discussing concerns about global institutions, multilateralism, about development, climate change, issues of that kind. But this is an unavoidable topic that is going to find place there, and perhaps a lack of consensus on this particular issue may actually lead to a situation where you may not see a joint communique at the end of the day. But I would sort of want to end my answer by saying that while I do understand that there is a lot of noise being created about the G20 summit in Delhi, I don't necessarily fault the government of India for making that noise, because this is an opportunity that doesn't come every day for the Indian state. And the Indian state has decided to sort of articulate its view or its vision for the international system through forums such as this, given the fact that it is not a member of the UNSC. And even the United Nations system itself is facing a certain existential crisis today. So, as Prime Minister Modi himself said a few months ago at the foreign ministers meeting of the G20, he said global governance has failed, and G20 has a responsibility to speak to or speak on behalf of those who are not present in this room. So I think this is an interesting summit, and I'm myself waiting for what happens tomorrow and day after tomorrow.
One of the things that is very striking about this summit is, of course, who is not attending. It was expected that Russian President Putin would not attend, in part because of the sanctions that he is under, and the risk now when he travels with a ICC warrant for his arrest. But surprisingly, President Xi Jinping also has decided not to attend in person, sending the prime minister to represent him. And so, really, the critical global leader that will be standing alongside Prime Minister Modi is President Biden, without Chinese or Russian presence. Is there a sense that this summit, this G20, is really where the United States, which has really been faltering in its efforts to engage the global South, and especially in wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is this a make or break moment for Joe Biden to really try to make the case that the United States is a better partner and alternative for the global South than China, than Russia, than the BRICS, which of course just had its summit in Durban not too long ago.
Well, that's ambitious sort of a postulation. Let me put that somewhat differently. I think Mr. Xi Jinping not attending the G20 summit in Delhi is part pettiness and part geopolitical calculation. The Chinese do not want to add to the Indian ability to be a leader of the global South by participating in a much talked about G20 summit in Delhi, where you may actually see the candidature of the African Union being discussed in a decisive manner. You may actually see the membership of the African Union. India has been giving a lot of importance to issues faced by the global South. You had a global South summit earlier this year, organized by India in the run up to this particular G20 summit. India has been foregrounding some of the issues and concerns that have been traditionally a set of concerns by the global South. So, in many ways, the Chinese have, I think, decided not to let India become the natural leader of the global South because they are also gunning for the leadership of the global South in many ways. Now, as far as the arrival of President Biden in Delhi is concerned, I think that goes to show that President Biden is very much in favor of strengthening United States relationship with India, and we saw over the last several years, India and the United States have made major strides in sort of strengthening their partnership. India is closer to the United States today than ever before in its history. All these are facts, but I don't think we can sort of conclude by saying that this also shows that the United States is behind or will stand behind the global South and its concern. I think there needs to be a lot more evidence to sort of suggest that. For instance, to begin with, we are looking at a global governance system which is pretty much unrepresented by the global South. India is not part of, for example, many of the global governance systems today. So, you need a lot more democracy and stakeholdership from the global South in the global governance systems. So, to that extent, do I think the Americans have done enough to assuage the concerns of the global South? I don't think that has happened in any case. Do the Americans think that BRICS is a major institution in the international system that needs to be engaged more proactively? I haven't seen enough evidence coming from Washington, D.C. For that. But I think these are two different things. That the United States is a great friend of India, that the United States wants to stand behind India at a time of geopolitical turmoil, including between India and China, that's absolutely accurate. Does that necessarily translate into the United States' desire to sort of bat for the concerns of the global South? I need to see more evidence to make that conclusion.
Nick, when you were talking about the image of Modi and Biden standing together, I thought, wow, that is a powerful image, right? Because we live on images here today, right? It's not just words, it's images. But it also made me think that these two gentlemen represent an older generation, and they're both up for re-election. And are we looking at two powerful leaders? Or is that image maybe a little bit shaky? And I wonder what the ramifications are then on our discussions of creating a new global order.
Well, I think when it comes to the United States and India, whether or not Joe Biden comes back to the White House, whether or not Prime Minister Modi comes back to, form the next government in India in 2024, there is a bipartisan consensus, in my opinion, in the United States that India is an important stakeholder in the United States grand strategy for the region. There is a consensus in India today that India is moving closer to the United States, and United States is important for India's Indo-Pacific strategy. United States is important for India to push back the Chinese aggression in the region. So whether or not these two gentlemen come back to the highest offices in their respective countries next year, the India-US relations will continue to be strong in the years to come. I have very little doubt about that. Whether the two sides will reshape the global order in a decisive manner, I think that is a somewhat of a different question. Can the United States and India team up together to sort of shape the geopolitics as it sort of unfolds in the years to come? I hope they do. I hope there is a lot more convergence of interest between the two sides on what the global order should look like going forward. There are misgivings in India about the current global order, and because Indians sort of look at it and say, "Hey, this is a post Second World War global order, which India has very little stakeholdership in, and therefore." That is not enough for India. I think as far as G7 is concerned, we may, if there is an expanded G7 and India is part of that, if there is a way India is accommodated into the UN Security Council, I think those are really indications of India and the United States sort of batting together and shaping the global order in the years and decades to come.
One area, though, with that, and given the fact that you're in Kiev right now, is that the United States and India have not seen eye to eye on responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Both countries, of course, condemn it, but the United States has wanted countries to take much more stringent, particularly economic sanctions against Russia. India and many global South countries argue that they also have other interests. They can't make Ukraine the central organizing principle of their relationship. Uh, is there a sense that you're getting, uh, both from what you're seeing around the G20, but being in Kiev now with the American Secretary of State having been there, that there is room for any sort of possible breakthrough at the G20 or elsewhere where some of these differences on responding to the Russian invasion between the United States and the West and India and other of the states of the global South and East that are part of the G20. Is there a sense that there is potentially a way forward to find common ground?
Well, I think in India, strategic responses do not change very quickly. They change very slowly. Indian strategic culture is such that systemic responses or responses to systemic developments take place very slowly. So, if I go by that logic, I don't foresee any major changes in the Indian position vis-a-vis the Ukraine war in a decisive manner in the months to come. But let me sort of unpack that a little more. I think Indian response to the Ukraine war, which initially was subtly pro-Russia, which is, I would say, changing bit by bit, if not in a big manner, is a product of three things. One, clearly, India did not have much of a relationship with the Ukraine, but India had a big relationship with the Russian Federation. Even today, 55% of India's defense equipment are of Russian vintage, which is decreasing, but it's still the case. I mean, you still have a long way to go before India doesn't have any major Russian systems in its armory. Number one. Number two, I think India is looking at the Ukraine war from a national interest perspective, through the national interest prism, rather than from a democracy versus non-democracy prism, or a West versus the non-West prism. That's not the prism India is looking at it through. India is looking at it from a what kind of responses will best serve our national interests. I think that's the way India is looking at it. And thirdly, I think there has been a change in the Indian position over time. India has, as you have seen, used language which clearly castigates the Russian aggression, if not taking the name Russia or Russian Federation. India has talked about the importance of sovereignty, the importance of international law. India has talked about the unnecessity of war, etc., etc. I think all of that sort of basically point towards the direction that this is not a war that India likes, but this is a war that is only in the longer term going to harm India's interests in the region. And why do I say that? For India, the principal contradiction is China and not Russia. For the United States and its allies, perhaps today the principal contradiction is Russia. But over time, it's going to be China, even for the Americans and for the others. But for India, the principal contradiction today and tomorrow is China. So I think India sort of calculates its responses or moderates its responses looking at that China factor. So if India moves away dramatically from Russia, then Russia and China are going to be the two major powers in India sort of continental neighborhood. India has pretty much no other friend in the continental space, and that's going to be a problem for India at a time when China is not only asserting, but is aggressively asserting and is taking claims to Indian territory on the line of actual control. So, can India afford to sort of give up that even the limited friendship that India has with Russia today and move entirely to a different sort of space? I don't think India can afford to do that, even if India is unhappy about that. So I think the China factor further sort of determines or shapes the Indian response in a manner that sometimes the Western commentators or leaders fail to understand. India may share the values of the West, but India is located in the non-West, and geography is something you got to live with. It's a fate that you can't sort of avoid and give up and move on. But I would say that this is an ongoing evolution. Look at what the Indians do. Don't look at what the Indians say. Even if the Indians do not condemn the war, are the Indians doing things which are probably telling you that India is moving away from Russia? I think I would sort of say yes. So go by what the Indians are doing, not by what they're saying.
I like that. Watch what people are doing and not saying. I do like that, because it is true, right? And part of course, of the G20 and the communique you talk about is that sometimes they're going to wordsmith it so much that it may not mean anything in the end, right? How many times can we count that these communiques coming out of the G20 have actually led to significant changes? But it's really sort of what's happening behind the scenes. And so I wonder, what is your sense of behind the scenes in terms of what is the most important issue, right? So here, climate, right? Hong Kong just got deluged, right, in South China with torrential rainfalls. We've had torrential rainfalls here and terrible weather patterns here as well in the U.S. Right, climate change is everywhere. We have the U.S. Open here. Some climate protesters just glued themselves to their feet to the ground here in the U.S. Open. Right, climate is what everybody's talking about. Is that something that is going on behind the scenes, or what is really the issue that you feel that people are talking about but may not be reported about?
I think I'm happy that you brought up the issue of climate. Unfortunately, much of the media coverage and the conversations have been about the security question, right? I mean, the Sherpas have been talking to each other about a potential final communique. There is no consensus yet, and the lack of consensus is primarily because of the the sort of Ukraine war, and how do we sort of phrase that in the final agreement. I don't know if they are going to buy the Bali declarations, language, or the Western side wants a different language. The fact that the Russians and the Chinese are not there in the room, at least represented by the top leaders, actually puts additional pressure on India in some ways. It's actually not giving India a free hand, because it puts additional pressure on India, because the Russians would expect India not to sort of put them throw them under the bus. So I think India is in a difficult position in terms of what is going to be the language about the Ukraine war in the communique. But as I said, I am not a big believer in communiques. So what does a communique do? At the end of the day, these communiques are for the press and for the media. It's not really going to alter the scheme of things fundamentally. I would be more keen on what these leaders are going to discuss on, as you correctly put it, climate change, multilateralism, on green energy, on developmental issues, on some of the other concerns that are plaguing the global south. And I have so far no clue on what is going to be agreed upon regarding some of these issues. This is a forum that is supposed to discuss those issues. It is not a security forum. For security, you have UNSC and perhaps others. So I hope that the Ukraine war, however unfortunate that war is, and it is unfortunate, I'm sitting in a country where I can feel the pain of the people who live here, and the leadership that has to deal with it. And yet, Ukraine war should not overshadow the concerns that plague much of the humanity, which is the global south, that are being discussed at G20. This is not going to be discussed at G7. This is not going to be discussed at the at the UNSU and UNGA. This is one of those very rare forums where you can bring on those issues. So I hope tomorrow and day after tomorrow, the leaders of these countries are able to get some more work done on the so-called non-traditional, non-security issues. That is how I'm going to determine whether G20 summit in Delhi has been a success or not. Not on the basis of the language that is going to be, as again you said, a compromised language that is going to be there in the final communique about the war itself.
Well, I think that that's a very important point. And again, going back to your earlier observation about watching what's done, what's not said, the President Biden is traveling with a lot of promises, but some of those promises are going to depend on domestic U.S. action. More money for the World Bank, more money for environmental concerns, more money for energy transitions. But if he can't get a Congress to appropriate, then some of those promises will go by the sidelines. But are there any other sort of sideline leader chats? I mean, obviously, a lot of focus on Biden uh, traveling to New Delhi, but are you looking at any other sideline conversations at the G20 that we might want to focus on? This again, as you said, this is Prime Minister Modi hosting this. He's able to position India to say we are at the center of these conversations. Expectations about European leaders, the African Union, the Saudis, anyone else that is traveling to Delhi, where we might see some of these, as you said, sideline conversations on energy, on climate, on food, on pandemics that we should be looking out for.
I'm frankly not aware of some of the other bilaterals that are going to be held, that are being held as we speak. I think Mr. Modi has several bilaterals that are lined up, including one with the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, where they will be discussing the future of the India UK FTA, which have been talked about a lot, but we don't have an agreement yet in place. We may have some conversations about the ongoing negotiations about the India EU free trade agreement, because some of the European leaders are in town. I think there's a lot of focus in India on climate, energy, and FTAs. Remember, this is a country, this is a government that paused all FTA negotiations in 2014 when it came to office until 2021. So from 2021 onwards, there have been a spate of negotiations with other countries on FTAs or other such trade deals. I think that's going to be high on the agenda when Mr. Modi speaks to the other leaders through some of the bilaterals. The other, I think, is going to be on energy transition and climate change. I'm frankly not aware of some of the nitty-gritties of these conversations. But I hope there is going to be some outcome in those meetings, because the outcome in the other conversation that has sort of dominated the media space is not going to be of any great significance as far as G20 itself is concerned.
So I wanted to mention a book, Happymon, that we read, 2034. I don't know if you're familiar with it, by Elliot Ackerman and Admiral Stavridis. And in that book, it's a discussion of the next world war. The spoiler alert: the country that comes out as the major superpower is India. And over the last couple of years, we've done several podcasts looking at the rise of India because of your population of young people and ideas, and the movement of ideas out of India, the ascendance of culture, because I think soft power is also really important in our discussion of geopolitics and global supremacy. And I wonder if you're seeing, kind of on a meta level, that this really is India's moment, more even than just, talking about security or talking about climate, that somehow this is the year that there's going to be a shift, that we've been talking about this shift right here at the doorstep for the last several years. And if you haven't read 2034, check it out. But is this the moment? What's your feeling?
I haven't read the work, but my sort of impression about what you just told me is that India has in many ways the attributes of being a major country in the international system. I wouldn't call it great power or superpower. That's how we sort of academically define it. But look at it this way: this is the fifth largest economy, the most populous country on earth, third or fourth biggest military with nuclear weapons, immense soft power. The diaspora, including the United States, is big. It has its own challenges, of course, of religious issues within the country, communalism, poverty, all of that. But compared to 1991, when India was almost becoming a basket case because of its economic non-performance, today it's a $3.8 trillion economy. It's bound to grow. So you're looking at a positive story here. Today, India has also not just the power in material terms, but also a certain willingness to contribute to the global conversations about global order and what is good for the international system. In that sense, therefore, however tragic and unfortunate it might sound, the current chaos in the international system has actually boosted the Indian ability to assert itself. Imagine this: had there been a consensus among great powers, including the United States, Russia, China, France, UK, etc., at the UNSC about how the world should be run, and had there been no Ukraine war, who would have bothered about what India thinks, right? Who would have thought about what India wants in the international system? Who would have considered India to be a major stakeholder in the world order? Nobody would have. So today, sitting in Delhi, the feeling that one gets is that, well, there is chaos in the international system. This is India's opportunity. If things are not, as Mr. Modi correctly pointed out a few months ago, as I said earlier, at the foreign ministers meeting, global governance has failed. Now, he's not lamenting about it, if you ask me. He's basically saying this is our opportunity. So don't, as a saying goes, don't waste a crisis. India is not wasting a crisis. It is articulating a vision that we are a pole in the international system in a multipolar world. India wants a multipolar world. Why? Not because there is an inherent love for multipolarity, but because its chances of becoming a pole are higher in a multipolar world than in a unipolar or bipolar world, clearly. Not because India has any great fundamental civilizational love for the global south, but India thinks that using the global south in many ways is India's pathway towards being a major power in the international system. So there are these very selfish calculations which all countries have, and why not? But I think it is better for the international community today, and for the United States in particular, to encourage the rise of a country like India, because of its democratic credentials, notwithstanding the aberrations here and there, and the ability of the rest of the international community to speak to India with reason, with respect, and with certain amount of equality. And India, of course, comes from a political and historical tradition of having spoken for on behalf of the global south, and it understands where they come from, and it is located in a space which is very important for the future of the Indo-Pacific, very important for the future of the rise of Asia, very important in terms of checking the aggression of China, globally and regionally. So I think here is a country that should be partnered with by the international community, primarily the United States of America. So, and the Indians have shown that they are willing to play ball if the international community uses the right kind of tools and the language. What does not work with India is that either you are with us or against us. It just doesn't work with India. Remember, it is a post-colonial country with a thin skin. You tell the Indians how to do things, they will not do that. You tell the Indians what's the logic behind something, then they will of course understand the logic. So speak to India as an equal partner. Speak to India as a stakeholder in the international system, and hey, here you have a partner. Here you have a partner who is willing and able to do things for the upkeep of the international system and global order.
Well, I look forward to partnering more with India and hearing more about the G20 summit and what's coming out of it. Thank you so much for setting the stage for us, and have a great trip to Kiev.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikolas, Tatiana. Wonderful talking to you guys.